Good evening everyone. In this episode we will present some real horror stories about people walking home alone. If you enjoy this video, we would appreciate your support through likes and subscriptions.
The fluorescent lights of Morton and Price Accounting buzzed overhead as Sarah Chen stared at her computer screen, the numbers beginning to blur together after 14 straight hours at her desk. She hadn't planned on staying this late, no one ever does. But the Anderson audit had revealed some concerning discrepancies, and Sarah had always prided herself on her thoroughness. That dedication had earned her a promotion to senior accountant last year, at just 28. It had also earned her countless nights like this one, alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home. The wall clock read 11:42 p.m. when she finally saved the last spreadsheet and began shutting down her computer. The cleaning staff had finished their rounds hours ago, leaving behind the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant. Sarah gathered her things, her movements echoing in the empty office. As she walked toward the elevator, her heels clicked against the polished floor in a steady rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The security guard's desk in the lobby was empty. Jerry's shift must have ended at 11:30. Sarah used her keycard to let herself out through the revolving doors, emerging into the cool October air. The street looked different at this hour. The towering office buildings that usually hummed with activity now loomed silent and dark, their windows reflecting nothing but empty darkness. Even the usual background noise of the city seemed muted, as if something was dampening the sound. Sarah pulled out her phone to call a rideshare, but her heart sank when she saw the prices. Some sort of championship game downtown had surge pricing at 5 times the normal rate. She checked her usual bus route, but the last one had left almost 20 minutes ago. Walking would take about 25 minutes, but she knew these streets well, or thought she did. "It's fine," she muttered to herself, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. People walk home alone all the time. But as she started walking down Palmer Street, something felt off. The streetlights cast strange shadows that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of her eye. The wind whispered through the urban canyons with an almost vocal quality, like distant conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. Sarah quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the concrete. The sound echoed off the buildings, creating a disorienting effect. It took her several seconds to realize she was hearing something else. Another set of footsteps, slightly out of sync with her own. Sarah stopped abruptly, her heart pounding. The second set of footsteps continued for exactly 2 more steps before falling silent. Sarah turned slowly, scanning the street behind her. Empty. A few parked cars lined the curb and a newspaper tumbled past in the wind. But there was no sign of another person. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The windows of the office building seemed to stare down at her like thousands of dark eyes. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast emptiness. No response came, just that oppressive silence, broken only by the whisper of wind. She turned back around and resumed walking, this time a bit faster than before. The sooner she got home, the better. She tried to focus on mundane things, what she would have for dinner, leftover Thai food in the fridge, whether she had remembered to start the dishwasher, yes, this morning, what show she might watch before bed, that new mystery series everyone at work was talking about. There it was again, the second set of footsteps, clearer now. They weren't trying to match her pace anymore. They were getting closer. Sarah broke into a run, her heels threatening to betray her on the uneven sidewalk. The footsteps behind her quickened too, no longer trying to hide their presence. They were heavy, purposeful steps. Definitely a man's boots, she thought with rising panic. Her mind filled with all the stories she'd read about women walking alone at night. All the warnings she'd dismissed as paranoid. She darted down Harrison Street, hoping to lose her pursuer. In her panic, she barely registered that this wasn't her usual route home. The buildings here were older, more industrial. Many of the streetlights were broken, creating pools of darkness between the islands of sickly yellow light. Graffiti covered the walls and broken glass glittered on the sidewalk like fallen stars. The footsteps followed, growing closer.
Sarah's lungs were burning now. She wasn't dressed for running, and her pencil skirt was restricting her movement. Up ahead, she spotted a narrow passage between two buildings. Without thinking, she ducked into it, pressing herself against the rough brick wall and trying to control her breathing. The passage opened into a small courtyard surrounded by the backs of several buildings, their fire escapes creating a web of shadows above. The footsteps slowed, then stopped at the entrance to the passage. Sarah held her breath, praying to whatever might be listening that her pursuer would pass by. Her fingers fumbled with her phone, trying to dial 911, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The phone clattered to the ground, its screen cracking on impact. A shadow fell across the entrance to the passage, elongated and distorted by the angle of the streetlight. It was massive, seemingly too tall to belong to a normal person. And there was something wrong with its proportions. The arms were too long, the head oddly shaped. As Sarah watched, frozen in horror, the shadow began to move. But it didn't move the way a shadow should. Instead of sliding along the ground, it seemed to peel itself up from the concrete, becoming three-dimensional. "I can hear your heart beating," a voice said. It was deep and somehow wrong, as if multiple voices were speaking slightly out of sync. "It's such a lovely sound. Like music." The temperature around Sarah plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the brick wall beside her. The shadow at the entrance to the passage was taking shape now, becoming something solid, or as solid as darkness could become. The figure that emerged was tall, so tall its head nearly touched the fire escapes above. It wore what might have once been a business suit, but the fabric was wrong. It seemed to shift and move on its own, like ink in water. Where its face should have been, there was only shadow deeper than the darkness around it, except for 2 points of light that might have been eyes. "Your fear is exquisite," it said in that multi-layered voice. "But do you know what's even better?" It reached down with arms that were far too long, fingers extending like shadows at sunset. The moment when fear turns to despair. Sarah turned and ran deeper into the courtyard, kicking off her heels to move faster. She could see another passage on the far side, leading to what looked like a better lit street. If she could just make it there. The thing moved with impossible speed. She heard it coming, those heavy footsteps now accompanied by a sound like cloth dragging across concrete. The air grew colder with each step it took, until Sarah's fingers were going numb. A smell hit her nostrils, like old paper and dust and something metallic, like copper or blood. She was almost to the other passage when her foot caught on something, a broken piece of concrete, a discarded bottle, she would never know what, and she went down hard. Her palms scraped against the rough ground, and she felt the skin tear. Warm blood welled up, a stark contrast to the freezing air. The footsteps stopped directly behind her. Sarah rolled onto her back, knowing she had to face whatever was pursuing her. The creature loomed over her, its suit rippling in ways that hurt her eyes to look at. Those points of light that served as its eyes seemed to bore into her soul. "Please," she whispered, though she knew it was futile. "Please, I don't want to die." The thing's head tilted at an impossible angle, nearly horizontal. "Die? Oh no, my dear Sarah. Death is such a waste. I have something far more interesting in mind." It knew her name. How did it know her name? The creature crouched down, those points of light fixing on her face. "I've been watching you, Sarah Chen. Every late night at the office. Every lonely walk home. Every moment you chose dedication over safety. Such delicious solitude." It reached out with those impossible fingers, and Sarah felt something cold brush against her forehead. Images flooded her mind, endless dark corridors, shapes that couldn't exist in normal geometry, colors that had no names. She saw vast spaces between the walls of reality, where things like her pursuer dwelled. She saw others like her, trapped in those spaces, walking eternally through landscapes that defied comprehension. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold was inside her now, freezing her from within. She could feel herself changing, becoming something else, something that belonged in those impossible spaces. "Welcome," the thing said, "to my collection. The transformation was both instant and eternal. Sarah felt herself stretch and distort, her form becoming fluid like the creature's suit. The world around her shifted, revealing the truth behind the facade of reality. The buildings were no longer just buildings, they were doorways, portals to places that shouldn't exist. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were living things, hungry things. And she was one of them now. The next morning, when Sarah didn't show up for work, her colleagues weren't immediately concerned. Everyone knew how hard she worked, they assumed she was taking a well-deserved morning off. But when she didn't answer her phone, and when she hadn't arrived by afternoon, people began to worry. The police found her phone in that courtyard, its screen cracked but still displaying an undialed 911 call. They found her shoes, neatly placed side by side near a wall. They found small bloodstains on the concrete where she had fallen. But they never found Sarah. The detective assigned to the case, Michael Torres, was troubled by the similarities to other disappearances in the area. Over the past 5 years, 12 people had vanished in similar circumstances, all of them walking alone at night, all of them in the business district. All of them had left behind their shoes, placed with an unnatural tidiness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But there was something else, something he hadn't included in his official reports. Something about the security camera footage from the surrounding buildings. The cameras had captured Sarah running, clearly terrified of something pursuing her. But what they showed behind her? Torres had watched that footage 100 times, trying to convince himself he wasn't seeing what he thought he was seeing. The shape that followed her was wrong. It didn't move like a person. And sometimes, just for a frame or two, it seemed to look directly at the camera with eyes that glowed like distant stars. Now, a year later, Torres never walks alone at night. He takes cabs, no matter the cost. He's installed extra lights around his house. He's bought religious symbols from 6 different faiths and hung them by his doors and windows. His colleagues think he's becoming paranoid. But they haven't seen what he's seen. They haven't heard the whispered stories from the few witnesses who were lucky enough to escape. They haven't read the journals and letters left behind by the missing, describing strange figures following them in the weeks before their disappearances. They haven't noticed the pattern, how each disappearance is followed by another within months, as if something is slowly building a collection. And they haven't seen what Torres sees sometimes, late at night when he's working at his desk at the precinct. Sometimes, when he looks out his window at the empty streets below, he sees 2 figures walking together. One tall and impossible, wearing a suit that moves like liquid shadow. And beside it, something that might once have been Sarah Chen, her form fluid and wrong, her movements no longer bound by human limitations. They walk the dark streets together now, hunting for others who remind them of what Sarah used to be, dedicated, hardworking people who stay too late, who walk alone, who think they know their city. The collection grows slowly but steadily. Each new addition makes them stronger, makes the barriers between worlds a little thinner. Sometimes, late at night, people walking home alone through the business district hear 2 sets of footsteps, one heavy and dragging, one clicking like heels on concrete. Those who survive learn not to look back. They learn to take expensive cab rides, to leave work before dark, to value their safety over their dedication. Because Sarah isn't alone anymore. She walks the dark streets with her new companion, helping it grow its collection, one solitary pedestrian at a time. And if you listen carefully on those quiet nights, when the city seems to be holding its breath, you might hear her voice carried on the wind. Your fear is exquisite. But by then, of course, it's already too late. The police files remain open, gathering dust in Torres's office. Every few months, another name is added to the list of disappearances. The only common thread, all the victims were walking alone at night. All of them were last seen in the business district. And all of them vanished completely, leaving behind only their shoes, placed neatly side by side, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and floated away. So take some advice. If you're ever working late, if you're ever tempted to save money by walking instead of taking a cab, if you ever find yourself alone on those dark city streets, remember Sarah Chen. Remember how she tried to run, how she tried to hide, how she tried to fight. Remember that now she's one of them, walking those streets forever, hunting for new additions to the collection. And if you hear footsteps behind you, don't look back. Don't run. Just pray that whatever's following you is human. Because if it's not, if you hear that multi-layered voice, if you feel that unnatural cold, if you see those impossible shadows, then remember that the collection always has room for one more. Can you hear them coming?